In my short introduction, I would like to highlight that the COVID-19 crisis in the last 18 months is a turning point from the point of view of gender, because it runs a risk of turning a slow-burning crisis into a fast-burning crisis. We speak about slow-burning crisis when you don't face necessarily an emergency, but there are deep and developing imbalances which at some point are likely to lead to some kind of breakdown or upheaval. And at the time of the COVID-19, indeed, we have been facing on several accounts developments which are likely to turn, or at least bring the risk to turn, slow-burning crisis to fast-burning ones in the context of gender equality. I would like to highlight three aspects in the introduction, and I think it will be obvious at the end why I'm highlighting these three. The number one is that we, in the previous decades, went through an experience when public investment, and sometimes investment in general, has been under constant pressure because of specific fiscal rules and economic governance structures. And at the time of the COVID-19 crisis, we suddenly found ourselves in the emergency because of the consequences of the constant pressure on public investment, because without public investment, you cannot develop sufficient capacities in the health and care sectors. And at the time of the pandemic, obviously there was a suddenly rising demand for the services of the health and care sectors. And in countries which experienced the greatest depression of public investment, even if the economy was growing for a long period, measured in GDP, they found themselves, and the people working in these sectors found themselves in an almost impossible situation, and a hugely demanding situation. And why is this interesting from a gender perspective? Because women are, as we know, overrepresented in the health and care sectors in Europe. So the last 18 months was particularly demanding, but it's not simply because a pandemic came, but it's also because we found ourselves in the pandemic after a long period of depression of public investment, especially in these sectors. The second example of a slow-burning crisis turning into a fast-burning one is the question of wages. What has been happening to wages in the past decade or decades? That the increased flexibilization of the labor market, which was enhanced by the development and the introduction of new technology, the development of network economy, network services, and the rise of the so-called gig economy, created a new environment when an increasing share of the work was casual work without the conventional norms of stability. And the gig economy started to create avenues leading out not only of the stability of employment, but also social security. The gig economy typically, though not exclusively, but typically has been a sector without unionization, without conventional forms of collective bargaining, which is a method, especially in Europe, but also beyond Europe, to keep wages at a decent level and subject of transparent bargaining between employers and employees at company level, sectoral level, and sometimes on a national level. So since the great financial crisis, as we know, there has been a lot of job growth in both America and the European Union. But in America, almost exclusively. In the European Union, about 3/4 of the new jobs arose in the context of the gig economy or other flexible forms of employment. Now, why is this an issue? Because wages have been lagging behind. Wages did not pick up as well as they could have if you look at it from the point of view of productivity and GDP growth. And the COVID-19 crisis gave an additional boost to the gig economy. Why? Because, you know, hospitality sector closed down, restaurants closed down, everything became subject of delivery, and the deliveries were delivered through platforms and not conventional forms. So again, there is an explosion of the number of people working in this field, where the bargaining power of the employee is very, very modest as compared to the conventional forms. So again, we have an issue, the question of wages and wage setting and wage dynamics, where the COVID-19 crisis is creating very acute economic and social crisis, at least potentially. The third aspect I would like to highlight is the question of geography, because COVID obviously created a crisis in terms of mobility. Previously, because the European Union offers free movement, not only for goods and services, but also for workers. This was for many people a solution to match supply and demand if there are imbalances in the European economy. And although a lot of people have the image of the Polish plumber, which is likely to be male, or the young construction workers who went you know, from Latvia to build the Olympic facilities in London. But more and more women have been involved. Why again? Because the health sector and the care sector and various other sectors in typically the West, or the higher income countries, or the higher life expectancy countries, have been absorbing a lot of workers who, either because they didn't have a job or because they didn't have a high enough salary, decided to find employment elsewhere. Now, as the COVID-19 shock last year paralyzed mobility, at least cross-border mobility because of the lockdowns. Of course, this was a crisis of income for many who had a certain degree of stability before, secured by the European Union. It was not secured anymore. It was not secured anymore, and it's not only the income level, but also the working conditions. When sometimes it was a necessity to bring, for example, from Romania to the Netherlands, workers to come, even at the time of the pandemic, the COVID-related safety rules were not necessarily followed, right? So it's also a drop in terms of the standards which are provided and which should be the basic norms to provide health and safety at the workplace, and also health and safety for every worker when they go to their workplaces, and not only after they arrive. So again, from the point of view of the mobility, but especially in the East-West context, indeed, there was an imbalance developing already, but this became a kind of new crisis we had not been facing before. Now, neither of these faster burning crises are without a solution or without a policy answer. Obviously, there is now a process which was kicked off even before the pandemic started, to revise the fiscal rules of the European Union. But to make the European Union more investment friendly and benefit more the people who work in the health and care sectors and be able to tackle inequality, the rules of fiscal policy coordination and economic governance in general need to be revised. You know, there are many other reasons for revising the fiscal rules in the European Union, but please bear in mind also the gender implications. On the question of wage growth and the wage gap, of course, there is a need for a certain type of regulation of the gig economy ensuring that all the social rights are also applied in the new forms of employment. So there is a regulatory agenda, which also has a very, very specific element on the table of the European Union decision makers, which is the directive on minimum wage coordination. There are more women working for the minimum wage than men in Europe, and the success or not of this directive will have strong implications on the gender pay gap and how it develops in the future. So please keep an eye on the future and the fate of the minimum wage directive. And what concerns the East-West mobility, the concept of the health union is absolutely fundamental. Again, interestingly, the concept of the health union already emerged before the pandemic, but it was the pandemic which also convinced the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, that this is a concept that needs to move ahead, to succeed, to lead to concrete results. And it cannot be simply something which allows for setting new standards in providing health services and maintaining emergency mechanisms for the next pandemic or the next acute crisis, but it also needs to ensure that the capacities are maintained in different countries on a comparable level in the future, and mobility and the imbalances investment do not undermine the health capacities in various EU countries. Now, this, of course, should be helped by the famous European Pillar of Social Rights, which our President Maria Jo Rodriguez also mentioned yesterday. As you know, the EPSR holds gender equality very high. It's the second principle out of 20 in the list of social rights that have been proclaimed in 2017 in Gothenburg, and now supported by an action plan which was again not only adopted by the European Commission, but also discussed among the heads of state and government when they had a social summit in the beautiful city of Porto. That also includes several gender-related proposals, for example, the directive on pay transparency, which is a very important one for Commissioner Dalli, but not only for her personally. There is definitely a wider interest, so we shouldn't allow gender policy becoming a kind of marginal policy on the European Union agenda. This wider interest is in making the EU more investment-friendly and capable of tackling inequalities in general, and not only in specific dimensions. You should also notice that with the action plan, the European Commission brought back concrete long-term targets, so not only to speak about principles, but to make progress measurable. And these targets also speak about the need to halve the existing gender pay gap and employment gap. So in a way, the European institutions indeed exposed themselves to more accountability in this field. And in my view, targets should be helpful to connect the objectives with concrete measures, whether these measures are at the European Union level or in a national level. And the final point is, of course, that when speaking about the long term, and when you have long-term targets, obviously you have to speak more about the long term. Indeed, it's very important to ensure that gender equality is more seriously discussed in the conference on the future of Europe. This is why when FEPS published this volume, Our European Future, as a main contribution to the conference on the future of Europe, and I believe this is so far the most serious intellectual contribution to this famous conference, we indeed included the topic of the care crisis and the feminist societies. So those who manage to pick up the copy or download it later will benefit from this analysis. Thank you very much.